Something I've kind of noticed is like one person's kickstand in the gym might look completely separate than someone else's. And that could be true depending on what we're looking for out of the kickstand with that exercise, or they could be doing it wrong in a lot of cases, particularly with a lot of our athletes. I see them performing kickstand variations incorrectly, so I just want to go over what we're actually looking for with these, okay? So what is a kickstand? It's a stance we employ in order to execute unilateral exercises from a position of greater stability and ability to load, right? If we think about the difference between a kickstand RDL and a single leg deadlift, right, an SLDL, our stability is going to be much greater in a kickstand stance. But what we're really looking for is that person to still be shifted completely onto that side, right? We should be looking to observe a fully lateralized stance, right? Meaning our center of mass is on a line from our big toe to our knee to our zipper, right up to our nose, okay? So if we think about standing in a bilateral stance, I'm right here. If I'm lateralized onto one hip, I'm here, okay? Straight line, big toe, knee, zipper, all the way up through to my head. A few separate things need to happen when we go into a lateralized stance, right? We go into slight internal rotation in the working hip, right? This hip is actually going to come up a little bit. That shoulder might drop a little bit, and our head comes this way. So a lot is really happening in order to get into a true lateralized stance. If you ask people to get onto one side, sometimes you'll just see them get onto the outside of their foot, and then they're just kind of leaning like this. That's not what we're looking for either, okay? But we'll talk more about that. All right? So in a lot of ways, these kickstand variations form kind of a bridge between our bilateral and unilateral knee and hip dominant movements we use in here. If we're looking at purely bilateral, we might be looking at like a 2 dumbbell RDL, right? Again, unilateral like an SLDL, okay? And then for a kickstand RDL, where do you guys think this kind of falls on the scale between bilateral and unilateral? A few kind of principles we want to keep in mind when we prescribe these, right? Once we introduce unilateral exercises to a client, right, we're introducing a whole new level of sensory motor competency, okay? They need to execute movement patterns like hinging and squatting, right, in the transverse and frontal planes, because once we've gone into that unilateral side, right, that introduces a rotational element. You know, we're moving our hips in a different way, and we're trying to execute this movement pattern like a hinge, which we could have been learning for a long time, right? Ideally, we'd be looking for them to find that unilateral position right away, but that doesn't always happen, okay? And the kickstand would be there just for added stability and a way that we can more easily load the exercise to hit the target tissues we want, right, in a unilateral stance as compared to like an SLDL where we're super off balance, okay? However, kickstands can also be used to assist a client in finding unilateral position, okay, or bias a certain characteristic of the movement, right? Bryce mentioned like the kickstand versus a wall, right? That's cueing our hips to get in a better spot is just one example. Okay. All right. So what's our desired outcome? Is our aim for clients to reach fully unilateral movement in all of their exercises? For example, SLDL, pistol squat. What do you guys think?
You go.
Yeah. Dylan, you got anything?
Just agreeing with you guys. I think that like desired outcome is all based on goals, right? So it's like in all these situations is going to be specific to the person. Like you mentioned, Elaine, the benefit of a kickstand for her compared to an RDL would be like to actually emphasize getting more range of motion into your hip, right? Like you're going to get more internal rotation into your hip in a unilateral version than a normal RDL. So for her, it's working fibers that she's not normally going to touch in a normal bilateral version. But an SLDL, is that a better form for her? Is that like a progression? Like maybe, but it could also be like taking away from what we're actually, or the actual goal is for her. So it's all going to be very specific to what we're looking for.
Yeah. I think in most cases, even for like our most advanced athletes in here, I'm pretty rarely going to give like a true unilateral movement to them, just from the perspective of that it's going to be more difficult to load target tissues adequately, right? Even someone who has great balance and great competency is really rarely ever going to be able to load an SLDL in the same way that they're going to be able to do a kickstand RDL, even if they're putting 95 or even close to 100% of the weight on that working leg. Yeah, what's up, Coleman?
Yeah, I was just thinking something.
You have the added stability, right? It would be a similar case if we had like a Smith machine or something in here, right? We might feel good about prescribing like an SLDL with a Smith machine because we're like locked in to that range of motion. We can find that stability even if we're completely on one leg. But for what we're doing in here, in most cases, if we can get someone into a really good position in a kickstand, we're going to be getting, 95% of what we're looking for. Okay? So we have some different loading variations we can use, right? We can do a contralateral loading variation, ipsilateral loading variation, like two dumbbell or bilateral, meaning like barbell or hex bar, right? Safety bar, or like goblet position. So how do these loading variations bias different positioning during kickstand exercises? Yeah, I think a nice thing about goblet variations too is that it helps people find a true center of mass when they're on one leg. If we're holding weight to either side, right, they're having to find center of mass and even foot pressure with a weight in a different place. So if we're in a goblet position, it's not really going to change their center of mass, at least in the like frontal plane, right? Sagittal plane will be a little bit more forward, but that's a nice thing about that. So can we think of a particular client who tends to be more internal rotation biased on one leg? Every time you see them hinge or squat, you just see like, I don't want to call it knee valgus, but you just see that femur kind of pop in every time.
I would say.
Okay, yeah, so he might benefit from an ipsilateral variation. Another good example is someone like Kim, right? She tends to go straight into a hinge and then just boom, that knee goes in every time she does, right, a kickstand RDL, or if she was in a bilateral stance, it would just be like that, right? If we were to give her a contralateral load, it would just get even worse, right? But that ipsilateral load is just going to allow her to stay more in that ER position, right, and really find that hip. What about two dumbbell or bilateral stances?
More load.
Generally more load. Same kind of idea with center of mass as the goblet. But in particular with positioning, it can sometimes, if we're using dumbbells in a kickstand, it can sometimes be tough to find people to find position, right? If we're talking about a kickstand RDL, this dumbbell might be in a fine spot, but this one might be in the way. So you sometimes will have to play around with where you put that stance leg just to make sure they can find space, or they just have to hold out to the side. Maybe a hex bar is a better option, but that's something you'll just need to keep an eye on. Yeah. Got anything, Dylan?
Just that like, even with like a two dumbbell variation, and I think, I think I heard you like coaching Rachel on this the other day. It's like, there's a lot of manipulation you can do to still emphasize one of these things that I might, say I'm trying to get more internal rotation, and normally I would go contralateral, but I want to load it a little more It's like I can really like maneuver those dumbbells in a way that's going to still bias that. So there's definitely a lot of like, smaller details as far as how we want to emphasize the movement, regardless of whether, the way we're loading it. And, I think the ipsilateral variation, if we think about that glute firing, that's only going to be true if we're actually not letting them cave in on this side too, right? So it's like the opposite. I'm going to want to cue a little bit of the opposite as far as this staying neutral and me fighting to not let this cave in, right? I'm fighting to keep this in line this way while my whole hips stay a little bit more on the square side. So you're still lateralizing, and that weight being in this hand is going to force you to lateralize initially, right? So, but it's just a little bit of, if I'm trying to target certain tissues, if I want this glute firing, I can't be going in here, right? I'm not going to get that nearly as much. So if I want this weight, if I want that glute firing, I want that ipsilateral load. I want to be fighting to maintain that knee being in line and not caving in.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Just got some like critical thinking examples here. We'll start with the first one. You're observing this client, right? They can find a unilateral position, right? If you just ask them to get onto one leg. But they tend to excessively hinge their front heel elevated kickstand squats. Okay? How could you change their kickstand setup to bias more knee dominant movement? Or how would you change the load? What would you do to kind of fix that position? There's several things. What I mean?
Yeah.
So imagine my front heels elevated. We'll say they're already in goblet position. And you observe them, they're in a nice unilateral stance, and you see them doing something like that. Is there a way we can alter their kickstand stance or loading in order to get them into more of a knee dominant movement? Something like this?
Yeah.
I think that's possible. It could work depending on the person. What else? Any ideas? How can we add some external feedback to this position to keep them out of a hinge?
Backwards the wall.
Back foot on the wall, right? So if I take this person who's doing this and I'm just gonna do this right here. And I put that kickstand leg just on the wall right here, what happens when they try to hinge? Butt touches the wall, and also this is going to cue them to stay more forward onto that stance leg, right? And then they'll be able to come down a little bit more vertical. What's another thing that might be an issue? It's simpler than you might think. Yes, they just might have too much weight, guys. Our glutes are stronger than our quads. So in a lot of cases, in a lot of kickstand variations, especially our athletes, you'll see them mess it up because they have too much weight. They're using both legs to do the movement. Going into our second example, you observe a client performing a kickstand deadlift, and their first leg is significantly easier for them to complete than their second. They don't have a significant difference in strength from one side to the other. What's likely happening? How do you adjust the exercise? Yeah.
For stability or fit.
Yeah. In particular, I think Coleman kind of hit the nail on the head with this one. See this all the time with especially like hex bar, kickstand deadlifts, or RDLs. People will be centered right here. They'll be like, oh, I've got weight on this leg. And then once they start moving, I'm gonna actually grab a hex bar so you guys can see. What I'll see all the time is people will start their kickstand setup something like this, okay? They'd be like, oh, I'm working that front leg, and they'll be right here. Am I lateralized onto my working leg right here? No, right? So what I'll typically tell people to do is on their setup for this, I just tell them to draw a line right through their big toe and have the hex bar right in the middle of it, right in the front, okay? And from that point, right, I can stay over that working leg and go from there, okay? But Coleman's right. See this all the time, especially with people who really like to load this up. They're working both legs at the same time, or looking at maybe a 60-40 split. Then by the time they get to that other leg, it's already really fatigued, okay? Anything else on that? Other questions? Cool. Yeah, a lot of times there's too much weight on the bar for them to actually make it a single leg movement, right? So oftentimes it requires a bit of tact, you know, to bring people's egos back in check, especially with exercises like this for people who might have been used to going super heavy on like a kickstand deadlift or something like that, okay?
And I would say that load thing is like definitely true. Just forget kickstand, but like split squat, all those kind of like moderately unilateral versions. Like you'll see with RFEs all the time, people just shifting back into their back leg, and it's like, if we're not actually going to load that front leg being like the main focus, knee dominant, you know, you'll see them kind of like do this sort of thing where they're like almost going back and forth throughout the motion, when the whole idea is we're going to be like very much loaded on this leg and be moving, you know, through space there. So, and a lot of times it is just a strength problem. Like, you know what I mean? They're overloading it. They don't have the strength to do it knee dominant, you know?
Yep. Okay, third example. This client shifts into ER at the hip of the working leg during the eccentric portion of a kickstand RDL. How'd you change their kickstand setup to keep their hips in better alignment? So you're seeing someone, they're doing a kickstand RDL, right? You start to see something like this. Contralateral load, yep, that's one thing we can do to keep them more into IR in this hip. What's another thing we could do?
Can you show one more time what they do?
Yep, so you see them hinge, they go something like this.
Again, like the wall feedback, like how I'm thinking about touching that working leg glute first to the wall.
Yep.
So that way they know they're actually shifting on top of that leg.
So you're talking about putting the stance leg back on the wall?
Yeah, having them think, all right, I gotta push my left glute to the wall.
Right, yeah, so having this foot here, right, is just gonna help them stay more square. Sometimes that's enough for people. You can just, sometimes that's enough. You see them doing this, you can say, hey, try to keep your right hip forward as you go into your hinge, and boom, they're able to do it. Some people need more feedback. They might need a load switch. They might need that back foot on the wall. Depends on the person. It's a good question. Essentially, typically it's kind of a similar thing for what we're going for, right? Like, I don't know, when would you typically differentiate putting the back heel on a wedge versus going against a wall?
I mean, the problem with the wedge is it drives their heel to be lower, which gets closer, more weight down, like into that back foot. So I think like the benefit of the wall is like that's pretty high, so it's more like it's pushing you toward that front foot compared to driving your center of mass backwards. So I think generally I'd probably avoid that.
Yeah. If we're adding like true heel reference onto that backside, right, on that leg, that's going to drive hamstrings to turn on, posterior chain to turn on, and we're kind of trying to avoid that. So yeah, good stuff. Okay, kickstand practical. Are there any variations you guys want to go over, talk about, kind of generally how to coach people into the position?
Real quick before we get into that, can I just add one thing to all that stuff that we were just talking about? This is true with most constraints, but almost all of them generally have like a pro and a con. Like it's like there's almost a drawback as well with that, with certain variations, right? So the pro of using like the kettlebell behind the butt as like a teaching tool is like you get them to like understand how to push backwards, right? The con of it is that sometimes people end up shifting too much weight backwards, right? And they don't get that like understanding how to like keep their center of mass right over the middle of the foot, right? That's just like an example. And I think that like the foot on the wall is another example, right? What it can work really well for driving the person to understand to push into that foot, load the side. What it can be not so great for is the sagittal competency, right? People who like struggle to get their hips under them in the first place, this can drive a little bit, if they're trying to push into something behind them, it can drive a little bit of like this kind of position from the start, especially if they're really tight anteriorly. So just thinking about like person to person, like you might try one of these things and it theoretically should work based on like the constraint that you're like putting them in, but there's going to be some people it's not going to work with, and then we have to try to figure out what is going to be like what's the next move for you, right? So in that situation, it might be a regression of exercise, or it might be just a little bit more detailed coaching in them and getting them to understand with like a tighter position, understanding how to lateralize. You might need another strategy to teach them what that lateralization is really going to be.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
With that being said, would you say it's like important for them to understand too, like the ability of like to shift their hips and whatnot prior to that kickstand variation?
You're saying like that kind of like, yeah, I think that's valuable. If you're introducing unilateral stuff, they should kind of understand how to bring one hip forward, how to bring one back, and that like, that side lying drill is like pretty useful just for like that proprioception of feeling what that feels like. Oh, like pulling that forward, pulling that back. But I do think initially it really comes down to just like what Dan said about like using little like cues and references to get them to understand that like it needs to be this, right? And like that is my starting point for my unilateral stuff, because I need to be centered over one leg, and whether it's a split squat, whether it's a lateral squat, like that is the understanding that they need to have, that it's here. And then if I want to do something different, if I want to load my glute a little bit more, like I'm still lateralized. Now there's maybe a little bit different emphasis, but no matter which way I'm doing it, like that's kind of what you need to get them on first. But I can't even do that if I don't have sagittal competency, right? So that's like we're assuming they have that and that they're doing that well before this is even like a thing. You know what I mean?
If I can offer some lowest hanging fruit cueing to get people into that position, like 90% of the time, it's just going to be weight distribution and foot pressure. Like most, if not all of the time, people are going to be able to get into that position if you just tell them to start standing straight, tell them to balance on one leg, barely lift the other leg off, and try to keep pressure on the inside of their foot. Most of the time they'll get into a position. And it might be super uncomfortable for them to hold if they don't have the competency, but they will get there for the most part. And then the key, right, where the coaching comes in afterwards is if they can execute their pattern while in that stance. But most of the time, again, weight distribution and foot pressure is gonna just bring everything else right into line. Okay?
Yeah, Maria.
Yeah.
I got a lot. Maybe we can talk about it later.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I do want to say, you mentioned about the correct stance for a kickstand, any type of variation. You have a physical feedback for the hex bar. How do you explain that to a person with dumbbells? So like as far as like too wide of a kickstand, too narrow, but if it works for them, like where is that gauge or that, I don't know.
Like what kind of external feedback could you give them if they're using two dumbbells?
So like what's too much, what's too wide, what's too narrow?
Like for the stance leg?
Yeah. Or is it just wherever they feel comfortable is where it's just a hair of support, stability to maintain majority of that weight on that working leg?
Yeah, whatever's most comfortable. But I will say the more this leg kind of will shift out, now we're starting to play with weight distribution because we have weight away from our center of mass. This might still be okay as a kickstand if we're like in an ipsilateral variation, right, where we have more weight on this side. If they're like turned out here, maybe we don't do that often. But generally, I just like to have people keep their kickstand as close as possible because it's going to allow them to stay more centered over this leg. Probably just to back it up again, weight distribution and foot pressure. If someone has their leg way back here, right, They're probably going to feel a lot more weight in the heel of this front foot. We're not looking for that, right? We're looking for like midfoot pressure, big toe. That could be as simple as just bringing that back leg in a little bit more. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Also, just from like a lateral perspective, Dylan, just stand there and get in your stance again. Like, just look at like his hip and knee, like relative to one another, and like the internal external rotation angle there. If he shifts his left foot out wider again, see what that kind of did to that angle, relatively speaking.
Yes.
Right. So that's going to kind of take away from a little bit from where we want it to be already. Right?
Now, I can do this, but I have to really think about getting into this hip a lot more with my leg out here. The tendency, right, is just going to be to always shift a little bit to where our kickstand is, because it's adding us a little bit more stability, right? Because we have the foot on the ground, we're never going to be like 100% weight on this stance leg, right? So we just want to try to keep it as close as we can.
But I mean, thinking about thinking like a lateral lunge or a lateral squat,
Yeah.
like that is what you're like getting them into, right? Like eventually, right? That's why it's harder,
Yeah.
right? So it's like that is what you want. You want them over here, and they should be able to like lift that leg.
Yep.
You know, but it's like that's why that movement is like a lot tougher for people, because they have to manage the fact that their foot is all the way out here, it's way farther outside of their center of mass, and they have to get all the way over one in a motion, right? Compared to just being able to stay where you are in your center of mass and then move your hips around it. You know, so that's like where you're still getting them. We're still kind of going to the same place. That's just like a little bit more of a deviation, because now we're moving in that frontal plane compared to sagittal.
Great.
One thing though, basically kind of adding on what you were just saying is like, and what he was just saying is like, you're gonna coach, like they could be here, they could be here, they could be here, wherever they are. Your coaching is what's different based on how it looks, right? Like, are they centered over? Do they have a good core position? Are they moving through the motion and not losing their center of mass as they're going through the motion? Are they keeping the hips where we need them to be? If they're doing all that, then maybe I don't need to talk to them at all, right? Yeah. But if this is over here and they start maybe kind of over their foot, but then as they go back, they move farther back, then all right, yeah, let's try a tighter stance. Let's tighten this up. Let's see if we can really stay over this front foot as we go through the entire motion, right? So where I'm coaching, when I'm stepping in is going to be based on like, are they passing these sensory motor competency things, which if it's too lateral, then, and they're not keeping nose over knee, over big toe, then yeah, I need to coach them out of that, right? Because that is breaking my rules as far as what the movement is supposed to look like or supposed to be.
Ideally, we're not feeling a stretch in a retro kickstand, because we don't actually need that leg to stay straight. It's just going to come back to weight distribution again. If I'm in a retro kickstand, right? Okay. And I'm coming back and I'm starting to feel hamstring stretch. That's because this heel is getting driven into the ground and I have weight on this front leg, right? So if I'm cueing to this stance where I have weight on this leg, really that front knee should be allowed to bend. This leg should still be nice and relaxed. A lot of times for people to get into that position, we do need to add a little bit of heel reference, because it can be harder to feel themselves pushing their hips back when they're so out in front of themselves. So a lot of times we'll have people have a heel elevated retro kickstand variation. But really, again, it's weight distribution, just cueing them to keep this leg relaxed, just let it sit there, or even have them try a couple reps with that leg just free floating, right? Or even have them get to the bottom position of it with it floating, put that leg down, and then have them come back up to the top where they can keep it relaxed.
Gotcha, okay.
That makes sense?
That's really helpful, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And in your mind, what is the goal of a retro kickstand RDL or deadlift? Like, why are we going one leg behind and emphasizing load on that leg?
My understanding of it was that
emphasis on internal rotation with that leg back there. That was my understanding. Whereas like if you went like a kickstand RDL, you're looking to get more extra. I mean, obviously it depends on how you load it, but that was just more like that.
You're just getting deeper range,
Yeah.
deeper internal rotation, right? So you're getting your femur farther back into that socket. So if I'm thinking about like, if I had this leg straight and I was, even if forget putting weight on it, even if just being straight and out in front like this, and I'm just gonna feel a stretch here before I can even get into this hip, then I've completely, like gotten rid of the point of the exercise. Because I wanna be able to get into deeper internal rotation than this, right? So like my end range here, if I have this foot in front, I'm getting just deeper into it, right? I'm getting more internal rotation. So I really want like as little as possible, and which way they do that, whether they touch their heel, their toe, I'll usually just touch this leg. Just get a bent knee, get pressure there so that like you feel balance, but it should just be as deep as you can get into this, whether it's a deadlift or RDL. I don't know if you have something to add, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, yes, and I also think there's like a target tissue argument too. Typically for like an RDL variation, kickstand RDL, we're gonna feel more hamstring. For a retro kickstand, we're gonna start to get into the glute a little bit more.
That's what I was gonna ask, was more like upper hamstring.
Yeah. But yeah. Anything else you guys wanna see?
I do.
Yeah.
Can you do, I'm sorry, last one. Can you do a kickstand RDL like right in front of me to where I can see the height of your hips paint?
Like this way?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm right here.
So if I see someone, everything from, below hips and down looks okay. They have already explained that they're shifting majority of their weight on that right leg.
Mm-hmm.
Hips should be even, right? That right hip shouldn't be slightly higher.
It might be, yes. So in a lateralized stance, that right hip does come up a little bit.
How much?
Just a little. Yeah.
Because what I'm trying to get to is like you don't want to see that left hip drastically
You don't.
drop.
So what we don't want to see is this, okay, where this left hip is higher and further back. At the bottom position, our right hip should be slightly higher and slightly further back than our left.
Okay.
It'd be pretty hard for them to like, I mean, for it to be dramatic, their weight would have to be on the left side.
Yeah. So for me to get to this position, I have to put weight onto this leg.
Okay.
Although sometimes you'll see people like, now I'm also feeling it. If I do it without putting weight onto this leg, now I'm getting weight onto the outside of my foot. So now we're back to foot pressure and weight distribution, right? That makes sense?
Yes.
A lot of kickstand RDLs, you'll see people do this as well. See the hips drop? Okay. Good cue for that is just thinking, again, horizontal translation, like with the kettlebell behind the hips. Think about pushing your hip. In particular, I always talk about the hip we're working. I'm not gonna say push your hips. I'm gonna say push your right hip up and back, and that'll typically help people stay in that spot. Yeah? Anything else you guys wanna see? Cool. Where we want people to start is pretty much in bear hold position, but knees on the ground, okay? So we're looking for that core, like hips still stay tucked for the most part, like neutral spine, rib cage down. And then from here, what I typically have people do is just start with the roller right underneath their body and their wrist right on the roller. Key point here is really to keep this arm straight. Okay, and then from here, we're just looking to reach that arm through as far as we can, while kind of keeping a good core position at our hips. So this is gonna get a nice stretch in our upper back and is also gonna get some T-spine rotation, as well as keeping like our hips stable. So what you'll see a lot of people do is like something like this, will they really sit back into it? Really just keep this arm straight, okay? Keep hips square. Try to drive some T-spine rotation right there. You can even have them turn that hand to the ground and make a fist. Pronating that hand might give them a little bit more rotation as well. And then you're back up to the top.
March. The alternating reach is basically a contralateral. Imagine it's a contralateral kickstand. You're basically emphasizing them completely loading that side and internally rotating into it. So this is, I usually have them just do it against the wall so they can get a little bit better like pressure, but we can do it here too. So starting at the top, right, they could bridge up with both, make sure we're tucked, make sure we're feeling that hamstring. I'm reaching hard from this side, taking a breath into it, and then I'm just gonna have them keep that hips, keep this hamstring on, keep everything firing until I get this one. And then I'm slowly, you know, if I'm coaching this the first time, I want them to understand like I'm slowly gonna shift my weight onto this side. So heavy, 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 pulling from this side, letting this one go slowly, and then I'm reaching with the alternating hand, right? So every time I do that, I'm just shifting them more onto this side. So again, like I was just starting to do that, right? I have to kind of fight that to keep my toe straight up. So I'm just gonna slowly go through that.
And you're just like protracting the shoulder, right? Or you
Yeah, I don't, it's similar to the cross body. Like I don't want a crunch, right? We don't want our sternum to lose position. I actually want to be here. So I'm imagining my spine is reaching, is driving back into the ground as I'm trying to get as far away with my hand as I can, right? So I'm actually getting that stretch of my mid back, whereas if I'm just crunching down this way, I'm not actually getting those tissues in my upper back to stretch. I'm just using my abs, right?
Right, yeah, that was the part that I was kind of, or not confused about, that was the part that I understood to be similar to the...
That is the part that's very similar, right? Like that reach is here instead of here.
Yeah.
Yep. And if we go to the cross body connect, the biggest, the biggest mistake, yeah, thank you, sir. The biggest mistake here is going to be this,
Right, exactly.
right? Where the goal, we're thinking that I'm trying to get my elbow to my knee, but we're doing it through a reach here and a reach here. Using my breathing to try to get into a better position, essentially. So I should be like pushing my foot into the wall, getting a little bit of a tuck every rep, and getting it as much of a reach with every exhale. Right, so it's here first. And they should feel more abs as they do it, but you don't want them to just feel rectus from doing like a crunch. All right. One thing to emphasize is pushing into the wall with this foot to start. So, because I do want to get this completely extended, this hip in complete hip extension, because that's basically just going to push me onto this side here.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
My question with this exercise would be
And I'm saying that's always what we want.
okay.
Or you're gonna have
Yeah,
to-
I get,
yeah.
no, I need some clarification on
Yep.
this myself. I have been kind of teaching actually not being in full extension at this hip,
Yep.
and especially with the roller, like to use it as hamstring reference.
Yep.
So I'll have people start with like a slight knee bend and drive heel down to the roller to get hamstring and hip in a good spot.
That's certainly more important.
Okay.
So like if they can do that and like drive, then great.
Okay.
But it's more important, yeah, like that leg is less important. You're just using it to get sagittal competency. So like you're right, like more hamstring curl emphasis to start. You want them to hopefully be able to keep their whole foot on this so they can get a little bit more of like whole foot pressure.
Yeah.
But outside of that, we don't really need them to be pushing into the wall too much. We're more emphasized on getting good like hip flexion through proper pelvis position initially.
So yeah, another thing IQ typically like is on exhale to try to connect. Think about bringing opposite hip to opposite side of rib cage.
Yeah.
Like not so much crunching it in,
Midline, yeah.
but like connect it on a straight line, basically. So if there was like a straight line from the top of my right hip to the bottom of my left rib cage, I'm trying to bring them together
Yeah.
while
I like it.
keeping hamstring and heel reference. Right.
Another question on, it's
Yeah.
like Dan picked his head up there. Is that something that's we're allowing?
We would like them not to.
Okay.
It's like I'm trying. Like again, it's like with all these things, it's like there's going to be my favorite version of this optimal version, and then there's like, are we getting most of what we want, right? And it's like, when do I step in? When do I like coach those things? And I think when you're first working on it and you're first teaching it to them, like I might mention like, hey, we were trying to keep our whole spine in line, like flat to the ground, right? And then they're getting most of like the hip flexion we're looking for. They're getting this like a really good reach from the right spot, but then their like head picks up a little bit. It's like, yeah, like eventually I want to continue to coach that thing, but if they're getting most of what we want there, like let's emphasize the things that matter.
Big boulders, not doubles.
Right. Eventually, once they do it a couple times right, it's like, okay, also let's try to work on this now that you have the staples, the real like fundamentals right.
One thing I just related to that point,
Yeah.
I do find that when their head's back on the ground, they're less likely to kind of come up into that like core dominant reach because they're having to kind of stay here.
Right.
So, like,
Well, that's the idea. It's like if I can think about my spine driving backwards
right, like your head's likely not going to come.
and I'm reaching away from my spine here. Is like what I'm always trying to look for out of any like coil position. The biggest problem that people do is lose sternum.
Right, 'cause as soon as the head comes, you're
As soon as I do that, I'm not going to get those tissues that I'm looking for active. I'm not going to get the right things on. So yes, but think about it. I could still keep the majority of my spine on and still get a little bit of head flexion. And it's like, okay, that's pretty good.
like it's the difference
You
between
know.
like this and
Right. But then the second you see that sternum move is like the real key of like, we're fucking this up. We're not getting what we want out of it. And it's the same thing I was working with you on, thinking about if I'm trying to get a active reach out of somebody to release some kind of tension in their upper back, right? Some mid scap stuff. If I turn with it, there's no stretch, right?
pull the shoulder around.
Yeah, exactly. Rib cage needs to either be, and if I want to really emphasize it, I actually want to turn into that side, right? This is more what I'm looking for, right? So it's like, that's how we're going to actually get things moving apart so I can get a stretch, right? So it's the same idea behind, like the distractions, right? I need those things moving apart. So yeah, similar idea there.
I'm sorry, I don't want to jump the line again. Translate that to, I see that you prescribe this to your clients. The cable sitting in the pit of their elbow and we're reaching. I've heard you explain this.
Yeah. Posterior expansion.
Yes, that's just,
Pretty much exactly what Dylan just said about aligning the body and getting that stretch reach.
and everything's still, pelvis is still tilted, we're stacked here, we're just reaching every breath. Now as I reach, this isn't opening up, you still want this
Yeah.
shoulder facing forward.
We're trying not to get it from rotation, or at least add any more rotation. It's going to come from expansion and essentially that shoulder blade kind of wrapping around the body.
Okay.
So like, if anything, you want to cue slightly turning into that arm.
Okay.
Because look, now that scapula has to actually stretch compared to here.
Right.
I'm faking it. Right, I'm faking that scapula.
Wait, can you go in that position again?
Wow. Really get that scapula to stretch. You can do it in different positions.
Yeah, there should be like a little bit of like a pack tension there too, or contraction with that coming forward.
More serratus. So like underneath the armpit outside of like pec,
Yeah.
could feel something there.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's why there is different positions. Like this can be just having them think about their elbow can be a little bit better sometimes than having them come across here. So yeah, you play with it a little bit, but it's like if they're emphasizing really reaching that way, it should be a lot better. Whereas then if they're like really trying to think about like adduction here, So that's why it's like there is these like little subtleties to it, like the cross body. It's like I do want them to get to that midline, but not like through adduction of their arm, right? I want to get it through more movement around their rib cage, more of that scapula getting a little bit more. So that's why it's like I actually thinking just reach first, and I'm really just kind of trying to let the breathing do the work. I shouldn't be actively doing this. I'm reaching initially. That exhale should just drive that scapula to get a little bit more motion. And that's how we're trying to do it through our obliques. So that really soft breath, letting it all out, your knee should slowly start to creep up if we're in a good position and we're really getting a good breath, and our scapula should start to move around. And that's what we're kind of looking for out of all these like drills where I'm getting that active reach, is like not to drive it through tension, to drive it through releasing tension.
Yeah. Some people try to like relax their arm as it gets pulled forward.
Yeah, and then it's just making sure like they're fighting to maintain sternum. We got, what time is it? What do you got? See if we have a minute.
Quadruped single arm serratus reach.
The bear reach. Yeah. Yeah, so along the same line of thinking, okay, essentially starting bear position, and what you'll see a lot of people do is just lift one side up. They'll think about lifting the opposite shoulder. Really what we're looking for is to try to get like this hand as far away from the shoulder as possible. So think about them what you want to cue is have them reach that hand through the floor. And then that's really all you're gonna see. Like on a nice exhale, reach through, they should feel it right in here. We're looking for, again, that scap to really like travel around the rib cage a little bit and then come back down. What we don't want people to do also is to turn, okay? So again, sternum stays facing the floor. Just reach that hand as far into the floor as you can and then back down. It's a pretty short range of motion, but that's really what we're looking for, right?
Yeah, I think one thing I like with that a little bit is if they like not even worry, like don't worry about them coming up as much as just like maybe coming up on their fingertips.
Yeah.
So they don't try to lift that shoulder as much. Yeah. It's kind of nice, just a little like continue to push as hard as they can until they can just release that side.
So I think even like, so Dylan's already like pretty protracted here, so I might have him just even relax a little bit more, like so we can start from a position where he can get more active range. So now if he reaches through, you'll see that shoulder blade come down, and then he can come back to the starting position. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I see online when people like when they're doing that, they're like again retracting their scapula. So I just like again tell them to reach through the floor with both arms and just reach farther with the opposite.
So like I think going with what he just said, have them to relax initially, and then slowly start to just. It's like the same as like the deload. Like I'm slowly, if I'm trying to lateralize, all right, get heavy on this side. Slowly put more and more weight on this side. Slowly deload this side. Right. It's kind of the same idea as far with this one.
Yeah.
It's just like get your weight on both arms. Really slowly, just try to like push only through this. Like push through both a little bit, and then only push through this side. Only push through this side. And get that to slowly elevate, but it is helpful to start from a little bit less like less protraction, less reach, so that they can actually feel like, oh, this is actually going through the whole full range. Yeah, let's do it. Okay. Fuck it.
Can we just walk through?
Stop swinging.
I'm so bad, dude. I'm so sorry. We'll cut it.
Can we just walk
Dan, you
through,
can cut it. You can cut it, right? What? Which one?
T-spine swimmers.
Yeah.
I just see a lot of people doing them, and I honestly have like, no idea how to
Yeah.
get into it.
Let's go to
T-spine swimmer.
let's go to this wall over here. Basically, think about any T-spine exercise. I'm using the wall here to lock my hips in so I don't move through my hips, right? I'm really isolating, only getting motion through my T-spine. So with this one, you're just gonna get some T-spine rotation and flexion. So I'm gonna go here to start. I can just start facing away. I'm gonna try to go through just with my spine as much flexion as I can. This way, go through as much this way as I can, and then I'm gonna rotate around here.
doing anything with your hips right here, or is the wall just kind of?
I should be locking myself in.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean the nice part about the wall is it's the same thing if I'm doing tracing the sun. It's keeping my hips away from contributing. So I really am isolating my T-spine. A lot of people are gonna have a hard time with that flexion in this position. Don't emphasize trying to get as far as you can. Emphasize breathing and trying to run the motion from that. Again, it's just like inhale. Very small ranges of motion that they are actually owning, and they can go through from that T-spine, not from crunching down with their abs again, right? So it's going to be a lot of relative motion with a lot of these mobility exercises. But the key thing is that, like, what's nice about this is it really does lock in, especially for that rotation. When I get here, it's like it will feel pretty good, but I am sort of like, it keeps them away from really cheating with anything else.
Yeah.
You have anything to add to that? Anybody?
For like sports specific, is it like beneficial for them to like switch knees here, for like someone who's like a pitcher?
Think about it though. You're getting both sides here, so it doesn't really matter. I'm only using the only reason why one is in front is the wall is just keeping my hips away from moving. Okay. So if you think about it, like they are. If this wasn't here, I'm getting the external rotation, or I'm like getting the open side, and I'm getting the closed side, and I'm going to do that. I can do that with both legs.
Yeah.
See what I'm saying?
I know what you're saying. Yeah.
So it's like we're only looking for gaining range of motion and having that be isolated. So there's nothing like really specific about it, but you're getting every side as long as you switch legs and do both sides.
Are you still cueing pelvis position to try to like lock in your low back right here?
Yeah, so it's like anytime I'm like, it's like the same things I would always do in half kneeling, like dig this in, use this front heel to pull yourself into like a little hamstring curl. I'm trying to kind of hold that the whole time. Especially if you're gonna cue that a little bit if they're having a hard time with it. But like, you know, for me, I kind of do it naturally in half kneeling no matter what. I just like, it's turned on. So I'm gonna kind of like own that pelvis position pretty easily because I'm constantly just like doing a little bit of a hamstring curl here. But yeah, we want to definitely be owning. It's with all these things, if I don't have the pelvis and rib cage position, like I don't have much. Like I'm gonna be faking through a lot of these things, and it's like maybe it looks kind of good, but am I actually getting like the tissues to be stretched? Am I actually getting like active range of motion through my joints? Like probably not, you know? So it's like that is kind of emphasis number one with all of these. And I think sometimes we like get a tendency, the reason why I kind of wanted to bring this up a little bit, or why we talked about bringing it up, is like I think a lot of times like we're like, get to me when you have your A block, you know, like when you have your like strength block or something, you know what I mean? We kind of like let them like dick around for the warm up and the prep stuff, when in reality, a lot of the like prep exercises, like the execution of it almost matters more because you're not really loading it, right? The intensity is not hard. You're not driving like a ton of tissue change with what you're doing. So if we're not doing it right, like we're probably not getting anything out of it. So we need to be actually like really particular and specific with the way we're coaching some of the, you know, these prep exercises, because as much as they're like easy from an energy output standpoint, they're actually like there's a lot of little specific details, and the reason why we're using them at all is to gain, there's a point, right? Like I'm actually trying to gain range of motion in a specific joint. I'm trying to release, you know, like global tension in their body, or, you know, so it's like, if I'm not dialing into the little details, we're getting nothing. We might as well jump on the bike. You know what I mean? So it's like, so let's be a little bit more in tune with like some of these exercises, be a little bit more on top of people, in just from a teaching perspective, and making sure we're not treating it like, oh, okay, yeah, like do your little rolling around, and then I'll get to you when we when we start working out. You know what I mean? Because a lot of, as we've like just kind of found, it's like there's some of these things that are actually like really, really different. Just like the difference between if I'm letting this reach and I'm not keeping this, then I'm not getting anything out of it. Might as well hit the bike.
What's that offset arm doing? Do I need to remain, I guess, one knee, or is it okay if that one closes a little bit?
I mean, you saw me. I can't really keep it, right? So you're as much as they can. This just like locks their position in more than anything else. it's not really like, you know, they might move a little bit through here. You're kind of trying to maintain a little bit of a stiffness.
It's probably going to drive extension of the spine.
Right.
You know, so wherever they can kind of keep that flexion position he was talking.
Speaking like anatomically, like is there like a difference really from the knee switch other than just like better ground to the wall?
No, it's like the only reason why we're doing that is to lock your hips in. And then it's like, but you'll switch sides and do the other side. So it's like, yeah, you'll get it. But no, just get the hip against the wall so I can't do, if I was trying to do this standing, right?
Yeah.
Right, it's like that's just gonna happen immediately. But if I do it here, I can do it standing, but this is way harder, right? So you're just giving them as much ground as possible, much pelvis and like hips being locked in so that they can actually get it from the right spot.
Do you want us to cue them to dig their toes in to kind of, because I know that like I've been talking before, like when I was doing like the T-spine extension stuff, that kind of helps us keep things within the T-spine as opposed to the lumbar spine.
Talking about back toes, right?
Yeah, like from here.
Yeah, I mean,
be like in the ground as opposed to like this. Is it like?
Again, in the scheme of things that matter, not massive, but like almost every half kneeling position, we probably want those toes dug in.
Especially someone that can't fire their glute. Like, doesn't,
Yeah.
isn't like Dylan can fire his glutes if his foot's fucking plantar flexed. You know what I mean? But if we have these people that are like, that already have struggled to like extend their hips and
It's
find
just
their
gonna
glutes,
help them.
it's gonna be another rooting point, grounding point, like Dylan said. It's gonna help them get them in the right position.
But you'll see people like, if I don't even know if I just did it right now, I assume I did, but even if I didn't, you know, if people have knee injuries or knee pain from putting pressure on the ground, they'll do that instinctually because this is a lot more pressure than this is. So that's something that keep in mind. Like if I want that done right, I might be like, hey man, just take a pad so you can actually put the actual emphasis and the intent into what they're doing. Because I think I just did that naturally because it's like a little painful to put my knee pressured hard into the ground.
Almost like always ask people, just like if we're not gonna make fun of you, like
No, right, like.
the pad's gonna help you do it the best way.
And I would say that's something like we can do probably more often with people, just if they're not half kneeling or they're not in like, they're doing some of these exercises like just on the ground, like you'll see a lot of people like almost try to do like a rollout without the pad. And it's like we want them to be like pressing hard and using the constraints so that they can really drive into a good pelvis position. So a lot of times with those people, you'll see them do this kind of thing when they're doing rollouts. And it's like just because they can't put the amount of pressure into the ground when we want them to. So it's like, yeah, like we need to jump in those cases. A lot of times the only fix is like giving them a pad and then it's like, oh, they can do this well and it looks way better. Yeah.
Great question, great point.
Great question, Coleman. Nice job, guys. Nice job, guys.
Outro.
Barry man.
Let's go from 1 to 10, Dan. How do you think that session went today?
I give it an 8 out of 10 minus 1 point for the profanity.
Let's go from 1 to 10. How do you think the session went?
I think it's a 10.
The cinematography, like look at Dylan's face.
Yeah, it looks good. Shot on iPhone.